In 1964, Alaska was shaken by one of the largest U.S. earthquakes ever recorded, a magnitude 9.2. Shaking went on for over 4 minutes. 143 people died. Total property loss in 2013 dollars was estimated at $2.3 billion. There were graphic fractures, massive landslides, and the destruction of water mains, gas, sewer, telephone, and electrical systems. The epicenter was in Prince William Sound, 74 miles southeast of Anchorage, yet the effects were felt as far away as Texas and Louisiana. Take another look at where the epicenter was. Please note, not only was this 9.2 earthquake in 1964, but it was located in a primary non-populated area. Can you imagine if it were to happen again today? But in a highly populated area, such as San Francisco, Portland, or Seattle. Well, it can and it will. A 9.0 earthquake along the Cascade Subduction Zone is predicted to occur within our lifetime. The Cascade Subduction Zone megathrust fault is a 1,000-kilometer long dipping fault that stretches from northern Vancouver Island to Cape Mendocino, California. It separates the Juan de Fuca Plate and the Pacific Plate with the North American Plate. The Juan de Fuca Plate moves toward and eventually is shoved beneath the North American Plate, which is the cause of immense earthquakes along the states of Oregon and Washington. The last known Cascade Subduction Zone earthquake to strike was in January 1700. It is predicted to strike every 300 years, so it's important to understand that it's been 323 years. This scenario would create a disaster like we've never seen before in the United States. The incredible rise in population on the West Coast and the number of cities built in the last 300 years add to the complexities of how decision makers need to prepare for such a catastrophe. This presentation will focus on developing a crisis action plan based on a 9.0 earthquake caused by a Cascade Subduction Zone. For this project, we specifically will focus on the city of Seattle. However, this crisis action plan can be used for basically any city located along the coastlines of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. FEMA basically predicts that should a 9.0 earthquake occur, any buildings west of Highway 5 will be at serious risk of total destruction due to collapsed unreinforced buildings, destroyed bridges, fires, and potentially devastating tsunamis. Using FEMA's comprehensive planning guide, developing and maintaining emergency operations plans, the City of Seattle must first form a collaborative team. They do this first by identifying the core planning team and engaging the whole community when planning. Founded in 1851, Seattle has grown in population to over 725,000 residents, so there are many stakeholders that can be represented in this first core planning team. Crisis management teams need a leader and members from emergency responders, EMS, hospitals, communications, finance, administrative, and operations of business. They should also have ties to other stakeholders from human resources, information technology, legal, risk security, and supply chain personnel. In a large crisis management team, an individual may oversee each area of responsibility, but members of smaller teams may fill more than one role. Typically, individuals represent the area of the organization in which they normally work, so they can bring their operational knowledge to the crisis management team. The next step of the planning team is to understand the situation. In the Comprehensive Preparedness Guide CPG 101, quote, one initial action is to build a solid understanding of the socio-demographic characteristics of the community and to think critically about how this information can inform emergency operations plans development, including advancing equity through fair and impartial treatment of community members. Community information provides the basis for estimating support needs such as sheltering, transportation, or disability or access and functional needs accommodations, end quote. Also, it is important to identify critical infrastructure and understanding at a high level how it supports core functions in the community. For example, Seattle has very little major roadways that go in and out of the city, and there are many bridges that drivers must get across. Should these bridges go down, people would have very little chance of evacuating. That creates a serious problem because not only can evacuees leave, but getting critical supplies back into the city could be a very big problem. This has been documented in the recent past. On June 7th through 10th, 2016, The Cascadia Rising Earthquake Response full-scale exercise was conducted by the Federal Emergency Management Administration, Washington State, King County, and the City of Seattle. Targets for critical infrastructure damage were identified and specifics were provided by the county and city engineers. Of the many alarming issues that came out of the exercise, one of them was that the regional trauma hospital has a blood system survivability of 3 to 4 days before a need to resupply. Take note that this is under normal conditions. The resupply center concerningly is 18 miles south of downtown, and therefore any blockage on the roadways would be disastrous for those victims who need blood. In the academic article Cascadia Rising, Thoughts on Seattle Earthquake Disaster Exercise, they concluded, quote, after a major Cascadia earthquake, blood resources may fail immediately, but even with luck, local resources used emergently at maximal issue rates will last 4 to 14 hours. For our crisis action plan, the next part of understanding the situation is understanding the risk. Risk is the potential for an unwanted outcome resulting from an incident or occurrence, as determined by its likelihood and the associated consequences. Basically, this is saying, what are the worst things that are going to happen if a 9.0 earthquake strikes? Once you can identify the most destructive predictions, then you have your priorities. The team can use one method of identifying the risk through FEMA's Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment and Stakeholder Preparedness Review Process, or THERA/SPR for short. Emergency managers should be trained in using THERA-SPR and should be able to guide the team in the process. On page 8 of Threat and Hazard Identification or Risk Assessment and Stakeholder Preparedness Review Guide, CPG 201, it says, quote, since 2012, communities have used the THERA-SPR to answer 5 key questions, helping them better understand the risks their community faces. This helps communities make important decisions on how to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond to, recover from the threats and hazards that pose the greatest risks. These 5 questions are, 1. What do we need to prepare for? 2. What level of capability do we need to be prepared? 3. What are our current capabilities? 4. What gaps exist between the capabilities we need and the capabilities we currently have? And 5. How can we address our capability gaps? THERA Step 1. Identify threats and hazards. Basically, what are the threats that the City of Seattle faces should such an earthquake happen? Step 2. Give threats and hazards context. This means asking more about the identified risks and threats that the team has come up with. Questions to consider in this part might be, how would the timing of an incident affect the community's ability to manage it? For example, an earthquake might be far more destructive during a weekday when everyone is at work. There are 1,164 unreinforced masonry buildings in Seattle. These buildings were built long ago and are generally made of bricks, and it's highly likely they'll collapse. If the earthquake happens at nighttime, however, people might be much safer as residential homes are generally more resilient to earthquakes. Step 3. Establish capability targets. This starts getting into what the city's goals for each specific type of risk and threat. THERA uses very specific standardized target language in this process. They use critical tasks that define activities that must be performed. The objectives have to be measurable using time frame metrics and impact for the critical task. Here's an example of standardized target language. Within blank hours of an incident, provide emergency sheltering for a given number of people and maintain sheltering operations for a specific number of days. Another one. Within blank hours of an incident, provide security and law enforcement services to protect a certain number of people affected, and within a certain number of hours, extinguish blank number of structure fires. Notice that all of these are measurable and concise. This helps the team know what is working and what is not working. Take note that it includes a time frame so that everyone can be certain that they've accomplished a goal. For Seattle, the team could say, within 24 hours, all fires will be extinguished. They could also say, within 6 hours, a pre-arranged helicopter team will have transferred blood supplies to the regional hospital from the supply center. And lastly, within 6 days, personnel from the Army Corps of Engineers will have reestablished at least one major bridge or built a makeshift one so that at least essential supply chain transportation workers can get critical food, water, medicine, and other supplies into the city. Decision-making is a complex process that involves having an understanding of various sources of information and deliberating the merits of each potential course of action, or COA. Doing so in a crisis is far more daunting and adds a level of complexity that is both unique and often unfamiliar to the decision maker. The team must therefore develop a crisis action plan and 2 courses of actions so that they have a plan and are ready when a disaster comes. They must then come up with a recommendation for which course of action that they would recommend. Creating a crisis action plan for a predicted 9.0 earthquake along the Cascadia subduction zone for the City of Seattle is a complex and critical task. The following is a crisis action plan and 2 courses of action with a recommendation. Part 1. Conceptual framework, current state. Geographical location. Cascade subduction zone along the west coast of North America at Seattle. A predicted earthquake magnitude 9.0 on the Richter scale. Vulnerabilities. High population density, critical infrastructure, and risk of tsunamis. Problem statement. The problem is to prepare for and respond to a catastrophic earthquake event along the Cascade subduction zone, minimizing loss of life, ensuring the safety of affected citizens, and facilitating recovery efforts. Desired end state. Minimize loss of life and injuries, ensure timely and effective response and recovery operations, maintain civil order and provide essential services, restore critical infrastructure to enable a return to normalcy. Measures of performance and evaluation. Casualty count, injury rate, and fatality rate. Timely activation of response teams. Availability of essential services like food, water, and medical aid. Restoration progress of critical infrastructure. Public perception of safety and government response. Risk to the mission. Delayed response due to transportation and communication infrastructure damage. Limited resources for search and rescue operations. Public panic and social unrest. Limited information sharing and coordination between cities and agencies. Time period for the event. The crisis is expected to peak immediately after the earthquake, but will require ongoing response and recovery efforts for several months. Part 2. Initial detailed plan. Operational period 1 week. Course of action 1. Evacuation and relief efforts. Objective. To evacuate citizens and provide immediate relief. Actions. Activate emergency response teams and establish an incident command. Evacuate citizens to safe areas and provide temporary shelter. Prioritize medical care for the injured. Distribute emergency supplies. Food, blood, water, blankets, etc. Establish communication with surrounding areas for assistance. Course of action 2. Infrastructure assessment and restoration. Objective. To assess and restore critical infrastructure. Actions. Mobilize engineering and utility crews to assess infrastructure damage, including bridges. Secure transportation routes for emergency access and supply delivery. Prioritize repairs to power, water, and communication systems. Coordinate with FEMA and federal agencies for resource support. Establish emergency operations centers in each city. The Crisis Action Team's recommendation. Although the team recognizes that under other circumstances, an immediate need for evacuating citizens would be prudent, and therefore it would be to recommend for course action number 1, evacuation. However, given the unique circumstances of the City of Seattle, evacuation could lead to more injuries, panic and hysteria, and a high probability that evacuees might be stuck in their cars far too long with no way of getting back home. The Crisis Action Team therefore recommends course of action 2, the residents sheltering at home so they have access to critical supplies such as food, water, and shelter. Course of action number 1 can be initiated simultaneously by evacuating those specifically with no homes to go to. Conclusion. The Crisis Action Plan provides a robust framework for addressing the predicted 9.0 earthquake along the Cascade subduction zone with an initial focus on the critical first week. It emphasizes the importance of immediate response, citizen safety, and infrastructure restoration while recognizing the need for ongoing assessment and adaptability to ensure successful crisis management and recovery. One final note. The Crisis Action Plan would be much more successful if the city encompasses full-scale exercises to train for such an event. They have in the past, in 2016, but they should do so again, or at least every 3 to 4 years. This would ensure that all responding agencies are ready and all capability gaps have been previously identified and recertified. The team recommends using the Homeland Security Exercises and Evaluation Program, or HSEEP.